let's go ahead and get started. So it's been 2 weeks since I was ill last week, since we've all been together. I believe we left off doing the agenda setting exercise where you built your own newscast. And we'll bring a little bit of that into the discussion in a few minutes. But when we last lectured, we talked a bit about ideology in media and what's represented. We're going to look a little more at that question today in terms of does media reflect reality, and then even deeper than that, are there social inequities in terms of what the media does represent. But first I wanted to play a couple of clips to kind of start the discussion, and I want you to watch these. They're about 4 minutes each, or roughly equal length, and it's two different movies. The first movie was made in 1941, came out just a couple of weeks before Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entering World War II. It's called They Died with Their Boots On, and Errol Flynn is the star of it. The second movie that we're going to play a short clip from was called Little Big Man. That came out in 1971, so 30 years later, almost exactly 30 years later, starring Dustin Hoffman. And the clip I'm going to play from each movie depicts the exact same historical event, which is the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So I want you to watch first the 1941 depiction of that battle, and then I want you to watch the 1971 depiction of that battle. Now, as you're watching this, I want you to note what is different about the depictions, and then think about, as you're making note of what's different, why it might be different in terms of our own social world realities at the time, 1941 versus 1971. So if you could hit the lens. So what did you pick up from the differences in terms of the 1941 depiction of a historical event and the 1971 historical event depiction of the historical event, neither of which were necessarily accurate, by the way, but I just wanted to see what you picked up from them. Yeah.
The new one was kind of more dramatic.
The first one?
The second.
Second one. More dramatic in what way?
Just how everything kind of happened. I don't know, because the other one was just there was a lot more action happening constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And this one was more focusing on certain parts. I felt like it was more dramatic.
Okay. What else? What else did we observe? Yeah, Jack.
There was just a lot more interactions in the second one. In the first one, the tribes actually displayed strategy with kind of running away and then having them all been ambushed from different sides. Whereas in the second one, they just went straight at it. And the first one did have a lot more action in it.
And the first one, just in terms of the depiction of the battle, what did you see in terms of the soldiers, in terms of how they acted in the first one versus the second one? Yeah. Did you have your hand up? Oh, okay.
There's a lot more dignity, I guess. They didn't hide.
Uh-huh.
And,
Yeah, they were very uniform, even against overwhelming odds. You'd notice how strategy never went out the window for a single second. They formed just perfectly, exactly how they needed to form to fight the fact that they were surrounded, whereas the second one, much more chaotic, wasn't it? Much more chaotic scene, yeah.
I think the same thing translates into the depiction of General Custer, too.
Mm-hmm.
In the first one, the music, too, when it picked up, when he was kind of the lone survivor, he was still fighting.
Well, let's talk about that, because the second one didn't use music at all. First one used music a lot. What did the music, the media code there tell us? I definitely got some messages from that, from the media code of the music. Yeah.
It made the natives seem like the enemy.
Uh-huh.
I noticed the music, and then it had patriotic music, heroic music for the other side.
Yeah, it had definitely had a heroic feel when they're depicting the cavalry, fighting. And then it shows the Native Americans, and you suddenly switch into these minor chords, and everything suddenly has a kind of a darker, ominous feel. Certainly, so there was definitely some messaging going on there. The depiction of Custer himself, first movie versus second movie. What did you see in the first movie, and what did you see in the second movie? What was going on? Yeah.
in the first movie, he was fighting with the
Yeah. Yes, and yeah, in the first movie, which is amazing that in the middle of this battle, he has time to go comfort all his dying friends as they get hit by a bullet or an arrow. So he's doing that, and he's fighting brave. When he runs out of bullets, he just stands there with his sword, just waiting to, as the title had suggested, die with his boots on. Second one, the character of Custer is portrayed as a slightly unhinged narcissist who's basically in service of his own ego, and it starts to kind of unravel for him when he's on the battlefield. So yeah, very different depictions of one historic event. How did the times, in your opinion, inform those depictions? When we talk about media and reality, yeah, Natalie.
I think the 1940s one was a little bit more sensationalized because that was before or kind of about where we were about to enter into World War II. And so it was very unified and organized, and we were very pro-war at that time. Whereas in the 1970s, with relation to Vietnam, we were very anti-war, and Custer was going on about how the White House makes these huge decisions without seeing the actual ramifications, and so it was much more erratic in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the two movies in the context of when they are released, you see one movie that has a lot of patriotism, so-called, put into the film. In that, as you mentioned, not only it's literally weeks away before Pearl Harbor when it was released, and its theater run was after Pearl Harbor, the vast majority of it. It's a time where we are just coming out of the Great Depression. There is a sense of we need to be unified because we may be going to war, where we've been fighting this depression. A lot more, obviously, more trust in our leaders as wise and brave people who will always do their best on our behalf. And you see that in the depiction, not just in that scene, but throughout the movie. You see that. And again, as you mentioned, 1971, Little Big Man. This is the height of the Vietnam dissension. We're just, in fact, at this point, I think 3 years or so away from pulling out of Vietnam. But protest everywhere across America, big peace demonstrations, a lot of distrust of government, which is only going to get worse because Watergate hasn't even happened yet, that's still a couple years away. But there's a clear sense of distrust of our government leaders in that movie. So the lesson to be learned there is that when we talk about social reality in our media and what it reflects, first of all, is there really a reality? Because as I mentioned before, if you're a historian, neither of these depictions are historically accurate. However, they do reflect who we think we are and what we think is going on in our society. And so it does reflect a certain reality, of the reality of how we view our world. You can say the same thing about programs throughout time in terms of what they depict. We talked a little bit about this when we spoke of ideology, the fact that for instance, gay characters in television series, how there are many more, how they're portrayed much more often as normal people like everybody else, as opposed to, the strange person over on the fringe there, as they might have been depicted in previous decades. So this is a reflection of our changing attitudes as a society toward different groups of people, right? And we talk about the 60s, for instance, as a big time of social change. Remember, we discussed the civil rights movement, right? We discussed the fact that it was a time of a lot of discussion, a lot of tearing at the social fabric in terms of what to do about segregation in the South, and what to do about people not having the right to vote, and a lot of landmark legislation passed at that time. So how much was that reflected in television shows? Was it reflected in television shows of the 60s? When you think about some of the shows that were on, Beverly Hillbillies, I Dream of Jeannie, Andy Griffith's show, you're not seeing a lot of social reality in there, are you? You're not seeing them having a very special episode on the latest in the civil rights movement. Those kind of things didn't pop up. In fact, where was the very first interracial kiss on television? Star Trek, 1967, at the height of the discussion, national dialogue on race relations. It happened on Star Trek. Did not happen on a comedy or a drama, of which there were many. It happened on a science fiction show. Why do you suppose that happened? Why is it happening there? Yeah.
Because like the show was kind of about acceptance and like there's like aliens and you know.
Well, the show takes place, for instance, I think something like 300 years in the future, right? So it's not about our time, is it? It's about a future time, and in a future time, these are the kind of things that happen. But was it really about the future? If you look, and I don't know if anybody here has ever watched the original series, but this even plays out in some of the movies. Is the Star Trek series really about science fiction gadgets, or is it more about storylines, morality plays, so to speak? And that's what was really going on. If you look at a lot of episodes from the original run of Star Trek, they deal with issues like civil rights in some of the plot lines they have, only they take place on faraway planets, so we don't necessarily on the surface see ourselves in the storyline. There's some people have argued, if for those of you who've ever watched the show or the movies, they have this thing called the Prime Directive, which is to not interfere with other cultures. There's been discussion and assertions that the Prime Directive was a reference to Vietnam. Should we be messing around with somebody else's country, somebody else's culture? So reality finds its way into it, but it's a safe venue. A show that took place in the 1960s might not have been a safe venue to tackle something like an interracial kiss, but a science fiction show might be more acceptable. Now let's talk about news. Okay, you would think if you're talking about reflections of social reality, your best bet of finding that would be in your newspapers and your newscasts. So how do you feel about that? Do you think the news media does a good job of reflecting our social realities? What's your opinion on that? And think about it in terms of the exercise we did 2 weeks ago with the agenda setting. This was you taking a bunch of stories in your groups and creating your own newscasts. And as we saw when we went through them, there was quite a bit of variation. There were some similarities, but there was a lot of variation as well in terms of what stories were chosen, where those stories were placed. So reflecting on that, can you make the argument one way or the other that news media reflects our social realities accurately? What do you think? Good question to ponder. I know you're all pondering it right now. Yeah.
Well, I think doesn't like everybody have a different social reality. So, news isn't technically right. It's right for everyone.
Well, I think I know where you're going, but just clarify a little bit what you're trying to say.
Like everybody has a different view of what they think is what
Mm-hmm.
issue should be brought up. So the news is someone's social reality, but it's not for everyone.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying there is that as you built your newscasts, you certainly found out that, well, here's the story I think is important, so I'm going to put this in. Now, I'm not sure this one's important, but I think people want to hear about it, so maybe I'll put that one in too, give them a little like junk food, so to speak, to go with their nutrition, because we want people to watch our show, so I'm going to put that in as well. So you probably, when you had your discussions, you probably had multiple reasons for putting one story in, or for putting it as your lead story, or not putting it as your lead story. But you're obviously creating your own mini look at the world, which differentiated from group to group. And as you pointed out, maybe it doesn't totally reflect what's really going on. So the next short video I want to play you deals with that topic. This is a 6-minute video talking about news and how it reflects the world we live in. So if you get the lights. Okay, so that was interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One, it's still very relevant, even though that talk was given in 2008, 8 years ago, and in terms of content, still exceptionally relevant. The only thing that's changed are the names. Instead of Britney Spears, it might be some Donald Trump today, right? If you took all the Donald Trump stories out of the news for the last year, what kind of hole would that leave in terms of what's being covered and what isn't? The one thing that was outdated in that, there was in terms of where people get their news. Did you pick up on that at all? In terms of, they had the percentages broke down of where people tend to get their news? Something was missing. Yeah.
And like the newspaper second.
Yeah, and what did you not see ranked in a high portion in that? Huh? The internet, yeah. Social media in particular, they're now finding that particularly among millennials that more than half of you are getting your news from social media. Not just the internet, but social media. And that's kind of a frightening prospect unless you are very good at vetting the information you find on social media. So what do you think about the main point she was making there about the things that are covered, how much they're covered, and what the implications for us are as we try to figure out the social realities of our world? Why is this important to talk about? Why is this a big issue, do you think? Anybody? What do you think? Why is this a big issue? Why is this such an important issue? Does it matter that we don't cover Africa at all? Does it matter that we barely cover India or Russia? Yeah.
I think it just shows that we tend to prioritize people that are pretty popular, especially in American society, over whatever's happening in the rest of the world. That's what we tend to think.
Yeah. There's the hand back there, or no? Or just somebody playing with their hair? Okay. Do we? How many of you have had a chance to travel overseas? Raise your hand. Just curious. And when you were traveling overseas, did you have any opportunity to watch news programming over there? English language news programming. Okay. I highly recommend the next time you travel to do that. In particular, I remember watching when I would travel overseas, CNN International or BBC World. And BBC World in particular was particularly fascinating to me because I was seeing stories from countries about issues I didn't even know existed. And I consider myself a pretty well-informed, well-read individual. And I was constantly, what I would do every morning when we were getting ready to go out for the day, I would flip on their news and see what's going on. And I'm hearing about things that I would never hear about in the United States. And I would argue important things that were going on. Not all big headlines involving wars or big controversies, but sometimes they were quieter stories but still had global implications. And this is what we're talking about. When we put all our focus on just a handful of things, are we really giving the audience, are we as a society really having a grip on what our social reality is? If we're only talking about our country and Iraq and a few other places, and we're ignoring entire continents, could we be ignoring problems that are going to come back and haunt us 10 years from now or maybe sooner? Very possible. So this is what we're talking about in terms of maybe the news doesn't do such a good job reflecting our social realities. You can also talk about that in terms of the kind of stories they cover too. For instance, there was a study, I believe, probably around, I think it was around 2003, they did a story on in terms of minority coverage in newscast, and as an example, they found that about 2/3 of all stories in newscasts that were about the Hispanic population either involved immigration or crime. 2/3. Now, is that reflective of what's going on in the Hispanic population? I would argue no. It's disproportional. But this is what I'm talking about news media coverage. It looks at problems sometimes and doesn't look at the good things that are going on. And so you get an incomplete picture. So you get a very slanted social reality of what's really going on in your world. So very, very important to think about these issues. Let's swap it to entertainment for a second, though, in terms of social reality. I gave you a couple examples of a historical event where you see social reality creeping in and how the event was depicted. What about just pure entertainment shows that aren't about historical events, that are not necessarily about big, important issues? Do they reflect social reality of what's going on? We've kind of touched upon this a little bit. I just wanted to explore this a little more. You know, if you watch Grey's Anatomy, does that have anything to do with social reality? What do you think? Yes or no? Yeah.
I actually was asked my cousin who works at a hospital like 2 days ago if Grace is like the same as a hospital, and she said that like the technical stuff, like the surgeries and everything, was like the same, but all the drama stuff was just different.
It's not as melodramatic as that. Yeah, not as fun to watch necessarily, but what they do, the kind of work they do is, yeah, certainly that's a really good point. What else?
I was watching one of his new TV shows, like Chicago Med.
Mm-hmm.
And, like the first few episodes were about like a theater shooting, and like this like one guy was like pranking the theater because he brought in like a leaf blower and it made it look like a machine gun. Like this one guy shot him,
Mm-hmm.
and like this one lady was like trampled to death, and so it was like right around the time when like all these like mass shootings were happening.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like.
Yeah. So, and you do see that like a lot of, for instance, if you ever watched any of Law and Order, SVU, or any of those other shows, they have a real tendency, you may notice, to rip things right out of current headlines, right, and then create a fictional version of it that the detectives then have to solve. So they're introducing some social realities into the programming. And you might argue that even the mannerisms, the way people treat each other, the things they talk about are reflections of a social reality. So just like we talked about with ideologies, point of views, you can also say that you can get a sense of what's going on in society just by how things are depicted. Even in situation comedies, this is very possible. For instance, I wanted to look at 3 clips now that are very different, but talking about children, the depiction of children in media, for instance, and what's reflective of social reality, how real it is. And the first one I'm going to choose is like from around, I want to say, 1957 or 58. Does it reflect social reality of the late 50s? What do you think? I mean, I know none of you were there. I was barely there. What do you think in terms of your guess of how well it reflects social reality? And kind of think about your own family experiences. Do you think that's what people did? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my grandma kind of something.
Does she? Yeah, I think there was definitely more of that kind of, I don't know how I would describe it, let's just say swear-free, less yelling type of environment in a lot of households. I'm still questioning very much that mom would have a pearl necklace on since we're eating breakfast before school, it's got to be 7 in the morning. I'm not clear on what that's all about, but certainly maybe eating meals around the table, because I do think that was more of a thing then. Now these days, I'm sure a lot of you have found in your own families, everybody's on the run, and communal meals maybe not as big of a thing as they might have been back then. But certainly that could be, you could argue that reflects social reality. Here's a question: can a cartoon reflect social reality? What do you think? It's animated, it's a cartoon. How could it be real, right? Or can it be real? Well, the next clip we're going to look at is from an animated series, and again, looking at children. Simpsons. We've all seen Simpson episodes. They were, with my wife, actually kind of controversial when they first came on, because our oldest kids, who are now like 30-ish, when the show first premiered, and she thought, oh, it's a nice cartoon for them to watch, and she put them in front of it, and then right away there's Bart popping off at all the grown-ups and doing things he's not supposed to do, and so she was upset that this is not good for kids, and I'm laughing the whole time that she's doing this, so I was no help. But the point is, it's a comedy. It's supposed to be goofy, but does it reflect any social realities? And for instance, with how the kids act, they don't act like the Leave It to Beaver kids, but do they act at all like kids act? What do you think? Yeah.
I think it's very different from like social reality, because in every cartoon, the kid always seems more aware, like while the parents are more naive or unaware, like Charlie Brown. It's all centered around kids, where the adults who just hear this weird trumpet noise.
Yeah.
My brother watches it. It's a like Dexter's laboratory or something. The kid is a super genius with the lab, and his parents have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't get away with anything as a kid.
How about anybody else? You have any thoughts on Simpsons and social reality? Is there any in there, or is it just goofy fun? What do you think? Yeah.
I think you said earlier that everything has some aspect of social reality, because obviously the world around the people who make the show is going to influence what they decide to, put out there.
Yeah.
So I think that a lot of the things that they portray may not necessarily be accurate, but they are definitely influenced by their world. So.
Yeah, and I always, you gonna say something too, Jack?
Oh, I was just gonna say it shows the social reality of siblings messing with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like right away, like that's how they become goner in the first place. Was her brother just riding on him?
Yeah, that's one thing. Going back to Leave It to Beaver, I always thought, wow, the siblings in that show are way nicer to each other than my siblings and I were growing up. It was a lot more mean-spirited at our house. So, and it's very mean-spirited at the Simpsons house. So certainly that part I could relate to a little more. It's also interesting changing times. They do reflect changing times in that. I think in the 1950s, for instance, there was a lot more of that expectation from children of yes, ma'am, no, sir, and being very polite and only leaving the table when you're excused, that sort of thing, where, and again, the thing that made them controversial with my wife all those years ago, the fact that Bart had no problem talking back to his parents and doing that sort of thing. And I see that kind of thing, reflected even now. Kids do. It feels like they talk back more than they used to. Maybe I'm just saying that because I'm the one getting talked back to, as opposed to the one doing the talking. So I don't know, but it does seem to reflect the change in terms of how constrained children are in terms of their social environment. And of course, for anybody who thought that the Simpsons were controversial, well, they didn't see anything yet. So, pretty typical South Park episode. And again, makes Bart Simpson look like an angel. Does South Park reflect social reality? What do you think? They certainly deal with a lot of social issues. I mean, they're very in real time with those new episodes. But in terms of how kids act, maybe not the preschoolers so much, but let's just put them at their right age of fourth grade. Do they reflect any social reality at all? How do you feel as former fourth graders? Oh, you put the lights back on, by the way. Anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like myself as a fourth grader, I was super innocent. And like in South Park, they're really vulgar, like adult language, and like at least know a lot more. And I did not like.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, the whole concept of South Park is like over-exaggerated reality.
Yeah.
So what's being depicted obviously is not what's actually occurring, but they're bringing it to such an exaggerated proportion that it's supposed to kind of shed light on it. So it's like a very exaggerated opinion, basically.
Yeah, which is the key to a lot of comedy, right? You take something that has a grain of truth to it, and then you blow it out of proportion to get the humor out of it. But can you see things like, okay, we had a few inappropriate conversations on the playground when I was in 4th or 5th grade. Not everybody, of course, but I can certainly flash back to a few conversations from my 4th and 5th grade playground, and not as bad as the South Park kids, but definitely a lot worse than anything Wally or Beaver would have talked about, for sure. So maybe it does reflect that somewhat. And there's another aspect of this too, because we're always talking about how those arrows go in multiple directions, right? So we say, is this reflective of, or does it reflect anything about our world and our social reality? And then the flip side of that question is, does it influence our world and our social reality? So as an example, if you're a young kid watching TV, is there a chance if you were growing up in the late 50s, you might model your behavior on the Cleaver family somewhat? Or if you're watching in the 1990s, if you're watching The Simpsons, could my wife's worst fears be true, that a young kid would watch Bart Simpson and think, yeah, I want to be like him? What do you think? Does it move the needle? Because obviously South Park as a program would not have even been possible 30 years ago. Yeah.
I think because it's animated children, it's more acceptable
Mhm.
because the audience is aware that adults are making the show.
Mhm.
So it's just adults coming through children. They're living through the children.
Yeah.
So I think it's more acceptable now.
Mhm.
I think they're living through the children for sure, but like, children definitely like can identify with those like characters because of this age and how they want to sell situations.
Yeah.
When it comes to like school.
Mhm.
Even though like kids can take ideas and try to like model themselves after characters and stuff, I think that it's based on how the parents react
Mhm.
to that portrayal, and it's just all about how the parents decide to parent their child.
Mhm.
Because I know that if I ever acted like a character, I'd get my ass beat by my parents.
Yeah.
So it's like
Mhm.
it's how the parents. It's about like the respect, I guess, between the kid and their parent. Like the parents set the boundaries, and the kids respect those boundaries.
Yeah.
They won't cross them, and if they do cross them, then the parents need to have the appropriate impact.
Well, and let's look at this from another way too. South Park, I want to say it's been on at least 10 years, right? Okay, which means most of you were about 8 years old when the show came on. Completely inappropriate age to be watching South Park. How many of you were able to watch South Park at an inappropriate age? Show of hands. Yeah. Okay. Which is an interesting, case study in terms of like you said, it's up to parents, and some parents are policing that a lot harder than others. Some parents say, I don't think you should watch this. Some parents might say, I think you can. It's a very individual choice, but it's getting out there. And that's kind of an interesting thing to ponder in terms of that, it's one of the dilemmas parents face right now in terms of media, in terms of everything you can access on a computer. And what point do you need to start putting safeguards on your computer for your young kids, and at what point do you need to start monitoring more? And quite frankly, my generation of parents were exceptionally ill-equipped for that because we grew up in a world that had very limited choices. So we tend to not realize it's a problem until it's already happened. Like, oops, that was possible? I didn't realize. So, and also too, if kids want to see something, they're going to see something. So if one of your friends at school says, oh, South Park's really funny, yeah, you should check it out, and you'll figure out a way, even if your parents are trying to shut it down, because you have multiple ways of doing it. But again, it's an interesting question to think about, because think of the South Park clip I played compared to the first clip I played of Leave It to Beaver, and I consider that both clips were brand new in my lifetime. That's a lot of change in programming content, isn't it? In terms of what is standard and what isn't standard. So it shows also too that even as we try to study this issue in terms of what does this say about us, how does this influence us? How does our social realities influence our programming? Even as we're trying to figure all this out, it's still constantly changing. It's like trying to hit a moving target, and it's constantly moving, so it's really hard to wrap your head around. Okay, so I want to talk about now a little bit the concept of active audience. When I say that term, active audience, what does that imply to you? Without actually knowing how we're going to define it in this class, what does that imply to you? Yeah.
People who watch the media, or like whatever type of media it is.
Mm-hmm. You mean like a media critic or somebody who's studying it? Is that what you're trying to say, or?
I don't know, just like a group of people who like actively watch a specific type of channel.
Okay, so I'm just trying to get a kind of handle what you mean by actively watching.
Just like, I don't know, like if someone watches the news every night, like they're not actively watching.
Okay.
Or like if it's like a show that's on every Tuesday, like they keep watching.
Okay, so you kind of equate it with maybe a regular viewer of something. Okay, yeah.
Someone that's engaged in what they're watching.
Mm-hmm. Someone who's engaged. Yeah. What else?
I would say someone that is engaged in a show, but also like going on social media and following their sites and just like keeping up with it and like always.
So beyond watching episodes, they're also following developments on social media, maybe getting involved in chat rooms about last night's episode, those kind of things. So that could be part of it too in your mind. Okay. Anything else? Those are all really good answers, but in terms of the textbook, they take a little more generous view of what an active audience is. And basically, it revolves around our belief in the intelligence and autonomy of people, the fact that we're all individuals and that we can all process information. And in that context, what the textbook authors say, and I think it's a pretty interesting way to look at it, is that in a sense we're all active audiences. In that when we watch something in the media, we tend to think, you may have used this expression before, yeah, I was just so tired last night, I just sat on my couch, vegged out, and watched TV. What's that imply when you say something like that? Yeah.
You need something to take the load off, like mindless TV.
Yeah, mindless. Mindless is the key phrase there. Like, I'm not thinking, I'm not doing anything. But what a lot of people have determined, a lot of media scholars, and this is certainly kind of a point of view pushed into the textbook, is that it's not really mindless. Even if you're just sitting there like a lump on your couch, your brain is processing what you take in. It's decoding, it's breaking it apart on some level. It may be a very surfacey level in some cases, but you're absorbing this. And your brain is trying to determine what's going on. So in this model, at its simplest level, of active audience model, the audience basically takes in these encoded messages. They accept and refine parts of the text's meaning or the visual's meanings that they are aware of, and then they apply their own cultural, ideological, political interpretation to that, okay? Let's use South Park as an example. There are people in this class who would sit down and watch an episode of South Park and laugh hysterically the entire half hour, okay? I'm willing to bet there are other people in this class who would watch a half hour of South Park and find it offensive on some level, from mild to extreme, depending on what the episode was. All right? How can different people be watching the same thing and having different reactions to it? It's that active audience concept. The fact that even if you are you're turning it on because you want to watch something mindless, you had a hard day and you're just, oh, this animated cartoon looks good, I'm going to turn this on. and then they tackle a topic that night that it may be very near and dear to your heart or is very much a part of who you are, and you say, whoa, I don't like that at all. So you've processed something. Somebody else might have a completely different reaction to it because they have a different ideology. So that's the whole concept of active audience, is that we essentially are all active and we're all constantly interpreting things, and which kind of leads, that explanation leads to another term that I think is good to get into at this point too. Polysemy. This term comes up in other classes as well. Has anybody ever come across this term before? Polysemy. Well, you probably will before you finish your general ed, because it definitely pops in a few of the general ed segments. But basically, when we talk about polysemy, we're talking about multiple meanings, meaning that when you watch, and in the context of this class, we're talking about media. When you watch something from the media, your interpretation of it, as I just alluded to a moment ago, is going to be influenced by your ideological, cultural, political makeup. That's going to factor very strongly into how you interpret that message. And we'll call it messages for now, because I mean, we're talking about watching shows. And when you watch a show, I know you don't think of it as messaging necessarily. You just think of it as a show. But the information that you're taking in, the dialogue, the action, whatever is happening, everything you're taking in, who you are factors into how you interpret something. So again, as I mentioned before in the previous example, somebody could find something, a joke, hysterically funny, and somebody else could hear the same thing and consider it deeply offensive. Or you could even have, since it means different meanings, multiple meanings, you might have a completely different interpretation of what they're trying to get at. An example of multiple meanings for people. You may notice if you watch politics at all that a lot of times on campaigns, when they have rallies, they play music when the candidate's coming up on stage or going off on stage. And typically, many times when they do this, you hear about the artist complaining about a week later that, hey, don't use my song, I don't want that in your campaign. But a lot of times when this happens, they're not even listening, I think, sometimes to the lyrics in terms of what they're playing. A great example was in the mid-'80s when Ronald Reagan was running for re-election, and he decided, or his campaign, it probably wasn't him, but his campaign decided that they would play a very hot new song by Bruce Springsteen, which was in the charts. That would be a great way to kind of get everybody ramped up as he's coming out on stage to give a rally speech, which was Born in the USA. Now, I don't know if we have any Springsteen fans in here. Has anybody heard that song before? Okay, good. We have a few people. Can anybody tell me what the song's about? We know the chorus, Born in the USA, over and over again. And that's what they were going for. Oh, patriotism. Yeah, I was born in the USA. Yeah, get fired up. Vote for Reagan. That was kind of what they were going for. What's the song really about? Anybody really listen to the song? Which is this, the fact that people aren't sure how to answer that is great too, because this has happened so much in popular music that because of either the vocals or the instrumentation or whatever, we don't always hear lyrics clearly in popular songs. And how many times have you listened to something and you go, yeah, I like that song, and then maybe you listen to the lyrics and say, ooh, that's a little offensive. I don't know I like that song anymore, yeah.
I used to work in an amusement park on Great America, and they played that song every closing, like every night when the park closed. That was the ending song, and they also closed it off with like Whitney Houston singing the Star Spangled Banner.
Uh-huh.
I feel like it's just like a song to show like American pride.
Yeah.
Showing like being proud of being from the United States.
And I think you can make the case with Star Spangled Banner that that's appropriate if you're trying to create American pride. And clearly the fact that they paired those two together, that's what they were going for. But if you actually listen to the lyrics of Born in the USA, it's about a person who served in Vietnam and saw all this destruction, then came home and can't get work anywhere because the American dream has passed him by. Is that really what you want to play at your political rally? Yeah, does that really really encourage patriotism in you? No, it's criticizing the American dream and saying that for a lot of blue-collar people, that dream doesn't exist anymore. So, again, people hear things, they hear parts of things, they develop an interpretation of what it means, and then they go with it, and then later down the road they find out, oh, that's not actually what the song's about. So it can be, particularly popular songs, can be very dangerous ground to tread on. So when we talk about active audience, we're also talking about a process that goes on as you receive media messages. And so there's definitely a concept and a different stages that you go through. So first of all, there's interpretation. Okay, so when you watch something, the first kind of audience activity is just interpreting your initial, as it hits you, reaction. Like I said, if you're listening to a song, it might be different. Your first reaction might be different than your third or fourth reaction when you get to hear the lyrics or get used to the arrangement. But something might be catchy to you right off the bat, or maybe not immediately catchy to you. So that's your basic interpretation. These interpretations, it's important to point out when I say your first impression, is that interpretations aren't fixed, okay? So you have first of all your individual interpretation as you see a source of media for the first time, and then you follow that up with the social context of your interpretation. And I'll explain that in a second here. So let's use favorite shows, because a lot of times if you have a favorite show, chances are a lot of your friends have that favorite show as well, right? You watch an episode of a show you really like. What do you typically do in the hours and days after watching that episode? What is something you often do? You just kind of keep it to yourself, or what do you do when you see there's some show? This is my favorite show. Yeah. You talk to other people about it, right? How many of you do that? How many of you have a show that you really like that you talk with your friends about it with? Okay. Yeah. It looks like about at least half of you do that. Okay. What happens when you start talking about what you saw? Do you ever see things from a different perspective? Yeah.
You start to, like, nobody thinks the same.
Mm-hmm.
It creates more conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the polysemy in action. There's the active audience in action. People are bringing their own individual perspectives to it. And then you sit down in a group and you try to figure it all out in terms of what was going on there and where's this show going next. And vastly different opinions, vastly different interpretations. And often it will alter your interpretation, right? Have you ever, for instance, one way or the other, you've seen a movie and you said, I really enjoyed that. And then you talk to your friend, your good friend who saw it too, and says, oh my God, that was the worst movie ever. And you go, wait, no, I liked it. And maybe in the course of the discussion, they point out some things you missed that maybe made the plot a little weak, or certain things that you weren't really paying that much attention to. And suddenly your opinion of the movie at least drops maybe a little bit. You may not reject it, but you may think, oh yeah, I guess I still kind of enjoyed it, but you're right, maybe it is kind of a flawed film, or maybe that was a plot development that was a little lame. So the conversation definitely affects that first level of interpretation and creates a second. So then the final thing in this three-step model is collective action. So, you've watched something, you've listened to something, you've had a chance to figure out what you think of it, Now you talk to friends who've also listened or watched this, and they have their own take on it. You discuss it. It changes your view somewhat, or maybe you're all on the same page. But for instance, let's say going with the example of a television show. If it's a television show and you watch the premiere episode, you guys are all really excited to see it, and then you watch it, and through the course of your individual interpretation and then your group discussion of it, you decide really wasn't very good. That was not a very good premiere episode, and I'm not so sure I want to keep watching this show. So what's the collective action that now happens? What's that? You don't watch it. What else? Yeah.
So you could watch another episode of each learning.
You could, and some people would do that too. But what you're going to see is it's going to affect ratings somewhat. If there's an overall sense of that wasn't so good, there's going to be certain people say, well, yeah, let's just give it a chance, give it a couple more episodes. Other people are going to bail right then and there. And you're going to see ratings that were here go down to here. So that's a collective action. Likewise, if everybody, or let's say a group of people watch a premiere of something and they say, wow, that was good. As you were saying, you talk it up with friends, right? Hey, you know what? I saw this show and it just blew me away. It was so good. You should check it out. Now, what's the collective action? You're going to see numbers go up in terms of people watching. If enough people have the same reaction, you're going to see an increase in viewership. So that's the collective action that can come out of this process. It can also come out in other ways too. For instance, if you see something that you find offensive on television, and it turns out other people are finding it offensive too. Maybe there's something racist about some portrayal that you really don't like, and you talk to other people about it, and they go, yeah, that was racist, that was really bad. It can manifest itself with a protest. Maybe you have a demonstration, or people have a demonstration in front of the production company that makes the show. So that could be a collective action as well. But this is how these are how things happen in our society. These are how certain shows become popular, certain media messages become popular, and others don't. Same thing with news. When you watch news, you're an active audience, and you're perceiving things through a particular prism. Here's a great example of this, and this is before your time. Doesn't feel like that long ago, but I realize it is. The Rodney King beating in Los Angeles. Who's familiar with that case? Okay, most of you are. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Rodney King beating was an African American in the Los Angeles area, was pulled over, and after he's out of the car and not resisting arrest, the police take their batons to him and beat him severely. Now, the reason it's a famous case is because this was in an era when home media was changing. Just a few years ago, previous to that, nobody had video cameras, or very few people had video cameras. They had maybe film cameras or whatever, but nothing that they could just grab off the shelf right away and take video. Well, now these were coming out on the consumer level, and a lot of people were starting to have them in 1992. So one person grabbed theirs when they saw this police incident down the street, got their video camera out, started taking video. So when the officers tried to say later, he was resisting arrest, the video kind of demonstrated that, no, I don't think so. It doesn't look like that at all on the video. But here's where it gets interesting. The video is pretty specific. You can see what's going on, and yet the interpretation, if you asked African Americans about the video versus white people about the video, it was very interesting that you would find that a higher number of white people were still struggling with possibly giving the police the benefit of the doubt on this. Okay? This is the example of what we call your cultural background in terms of how you perceive things. So if you did not grow up with bad experiences with police, then you're more likely to think, well, there must have been a reason. There must be something that's not in the video that we missed. And that's something you have to factor in. I had the same experience a few years later when O.J. Simpson was on a trial for murder, and this was a big televised case. And it was watched every day. I was working as a news anchor at the time. My co-anchor, she was African American, and we, every day after the news, we were both news junkies. So we would talk about the stories we've been covering, things that were going on, what our opinions were. And I would say 90% of the time, we were in total agreement in terms of our interpretation of what we were seeing in the news. Very few times we ever disagreed about anything. So as the trial is starting to wrap up, I made a comment to her in conversation to the effect of, O.J. is definitely guilty. There's just no way he's not guilty. And she responds, I don't know about that. And I was stunned because in my mind there could be no doubt. But in her mind there was a doubt. So we discussed it further, and I kind of came to a realization. It was one of those aha moments where you realize she grew up, we're about the same age, she grew up in an inner city and saw firsthand police abuse African American citizens. That's the world she grew up in. I grew up, conversely, in small towns. The first small town I grew up in was a small town in the middle of Iowa, okay? It doesn't get less diverse than that, okay? And in that world, the policeman was your friend. So we already had certain things built into our perception DNA, so to speak, that was a filter we saw things through. Now, that's something that I think we forget to recognize. We don't recognize that people come from different backgrounds and have different experiences, which explains why they are willing to believe one thing over another. And it's a really a very critical thing to think about in terms of trying to make sense of media and media messages, and why, again, it can be such a complex and confusing issue as you try to figure out how it mixes into the soup that we call our social world. All right, so I'm going to wrap there for now, but a couple things, quick notes, just to keep everybody on the same page, because believe it or not, next week will be my last lecture for this class. I know, you're bitterly disappointed, right? I can see it in your faces. This is horrible. No, because we're that far in the semester now. Next week, we have our last lecture. We're going to be dealing with chapters 9 and 10 of the textbook.
Make sure you're not packing up, please. It's really early.
Yeah, we are early, so yeah, don't get in the sprint mode just yet. But we are going to then the following week. So next week, that would be the 10th. So the 17th is going to be our exam, second and final of the two exams that we have in this class. That will be on the 17th. So next week, after lecture, I will be giving out the study guide for exam number 2. Then, I believe that takes us into Thanksgiving week. Obviously, we're not meeting that week. And when we come back, I think that brings us up to, if I'm not mistaken, we're then into the presentations. So everybody heard about the presentations in their sections yet? Okay. If you're shaking your head no, you're probably in the Thursday section today, so you'll probably hear about it today. But basically what's going to happen is all of the classes, all the sections are going to be broken into like 4 groups per section. And then what we're going to do for the final class meetings is we are going to have groups present on important media issues. A presentation, it's like a 12 to 15 minute presentation, group presentations. So it's going to be like 12 groups total. Half the groups will present one week, the other half will present the other week. So I get to sit back and watch you guys inform me on topics, which I always enjoy, because in these presentations, typically you come up with some interesting variations on some big issues. So that's coming up. So we're in the home stretch here, and I just want to keep people aware of that. If you have any questions about anything going on, well, in terms of the group presentation, you can talk about that within your sections. In terms of anything involving the upcoming exam, always happy to talk to you either after class or during my office hours, so don't hesitate to contact me. All right, that should do it. You can go.